The daguerreotype was cracked along one corner, its silver surface tarnished with age. But Samuel Porter's face remained clear in the sepia tones of 1876. 12 years old, fair-haired, wearing his Sunday best, a white cotton shirt and dark suspenders over wool trousers, he stood beside the newly built Cedar Creek Methodist Church with one hand resting on a wooden fence post. His expression was serious, as befitted formal photography of the era, but his eyes held the unmistakable spark of boyhood mischief. The photograph sat on Ezra Porter's mantelpiece for 47 years, from the autumn of 1876 until the old man's death in 1923. It was the last image taken of Samuel before he vanished on a scorching September afternoon, disappearing into the vast Texas prairie as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed him whole. Cedar Creek, Texas, in 1876, was a community balanced precariously between civilization and wilderness. Founded 8 years earlier by families seeking fertile farmland and fresh starts after the Civil War, it consisted of 43 families scattered across the rolling hills between the Brazos and Trinity Rivers, roughly 60 miles southeast of Dallas. The town proper was little more than a wide dirt street, lined with wooden buildings: Bradshaw's General Store, the Methodist Church, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of other essential businesses. It was frontier country still, where coyotes howled at night beyond the circle of lamplight, where Comanche raids remained a recent memory, where children learned to shoot before they learned to read. But it was also a place where doors stayed unlocked, where neighbors helped with harvests without being asked, where the disappearance of a child was unthinkable precisely because the community was so small and tight-knit that everyone watched everyone else's young ones as their own. Samuel Porter had been born in Cedar Creek in 1864, the son of Ezra Porter, a farmer and part-time preacher, and his wife Margaret. He was their only surviving child. 2 daughters had died in infancy, victims of fever and the harsh realities of frontier medicine. Samuel was precious to his parents in the way that only children who survive when others don't can be, cherished and protected, but also expected to carry the weight of family hopes. He was a bright boy, quick with numbers and letters, already talking about attending the new teachers' college in Huntsville when he came of age. But he was also restless, drawn to the vast spaces beyond the settlement's boundaries, fascinated by the stories traveling merchants told of life in the wider world. On September 14th, 1876, Samuel had risen before dawn to help his father with the morning chores. It was cotton-picking season, and every hand was needed to bring in the crop before the autumn rains began. Neighbors later remembered seeing him working alongside Ezra in the fields south of town, his fair hair bright under the climbing sun. Around midday, Margaret had sent Samuel to Bradshaw's store with a list of supplies needed for the afternoon meal. The errand was routine. Samuel made the half-mile walk to town several times a week, knew every family along the way, could navigate the dusty streets with his eyes closed. Thomas Bradshaw later recalled the boy's visit with painful clarity. Samuel had seemed excited about something, more talkative than usual. He'd asked questions about the wagon trains that sometimes passed through Cedar Creek, wanted to know how long it took to reach California, whether a man could make his fortune in the gold fields. Figured he was just curious, Bradshaw would later tell investigators. Boys his age always got dreams of adventure, didn't think nothing of it. Samuel had purchased the items on his mother's list, flour, salt pork, molasses, and accepted a peppermint stick that Bradshaw offered from the jar beside the cash box. He'd left the store around 1 o'clock, carrying his purchases in a cloth sack, heading north toward the Porter farm. He never arrived home. When Samuel failed to appear for the midday meal, Margaret Porter initially felt more annoyance than concern. 12-year-old boys were easily distracted, prone to detours and delays. Perhaps he'd stopped to fish in Willow Creek, or had encountered friends and lost track of time. By 3 o'clock, with the afternoon heat pressing down like a physical weight and no sign of her son, Margaret's irritation had transformed into worry. She walked the road to town herself, stopping at every house to ask if anyone had seen Samuel. All reported the same thing. Yes, they'd seen him walking toward home around 1 o'clock, carrying the cloth sack, moving at his normal, unhurried pace. The last confirmed sighting was from elderly Mrs. Henderson, who lived at the northern edge of town. She'd been hanging laundry in her yard when Samuel passed by, had waved to him from across the fence. He'd waved back and called out a greeting, then continued north along the main road toward home. Beyond Mrs. Henderson's house, the road curved through a stand of oak trees before emerging into open prairie. It was in that stretch of woodland, perhaps 200 yards from the last houses of Cedar Creek, that Samuel Porter had simply vanished. Ezra Porter organized the first search party before sunset. 20 men from the surrounding farms gathered at the Henderson place, armed with rifles and lanterns, spreading out in a line across the countryside. They searched through the night, calling Samuel's name until their voices grew hoarse, examining every gully and creek bed where a boy might have fallen or hidden. As dawn broke on September 15th, the search had expanded to include virtually every able-bodied man in the county. They combed the prairie for miles in every direction, followed cattle trails and game paths, checked abandoned homesteads and natural caves. Dogs were brought in to track the boy's scent, but the trail ended abruptly at the edge of the oak grove, as if Samuel had simply ceased to exist. Sheriff William Hartwell had ridden down from the county seat at Corsicana, bringing with him a grim understanding of the possibilities that faced missing children on the frontier. Indian raids had become rare by 1876, but they weren't unheard of. Wild animals could take a child, though they usually left signs of struggle. Accidents were possible. A fall into a hidden sinkhole, a bite from a poisonous snake. But again, there should have been evidence. The most disturbing possibility, and the one Hartwell kept to himself initially, was that Samuel had been taken by someone who knew him, someone he'd trusted enough to approach without alarm. The frontier attracted many kinds of men, and not all of them were guided by Christian virtue. As the search entered its third day, suspicion began to fall on the community's newest resident. Jonas Muller had arrived in Cedar Creek only 2 months earlier, claiming to be a traveling merchant, temporarily settling in the area to rest his horses and repair his wagon. He'd rented space in the back of Bradshaw's store, lived quietly, kept to himself, except for occasional visits to the tavern that operated illegally out of the blacksmith's back room. Muller was a large man, well over 6 feet, with the kind of rough appearance that suggested a hard life on the road. His wagon was filled with goods of questionable origin, jewelry that seemed too fine for honest trade, weapons that bore no maker's marks, bottles of patent medicine that smelled more like grain alcohol than healing tonic. He claimed to be headed for California eventually, said he was waiting for a larger wagon train to join for safety. But weeks had passed, several trains had come through Cedar Creek, and Muller had made no move to join any of them. His presence in the community had become a source of quiet unease even before Samuel's disappearance. Sheriff Hartwell questioned Muller on the afternoon of September 16th, 3 days after the boy had vanished. The merchant was cooperative but evasive, answering questions with careful precision while revealing little actual information. Yes, he'd seen Samuel Porter around town. Nice boy, polite, well-raised. No, he'd had no particular interaction with him beyond normal pleasantries. On the day Samuel disappeared, Muller claimed to have been in his quarters behind the store, taking inventory of his goods and writing letters to associates in other towns. Could anyone verify his whereabouts that afternoon? Muller's jaw tightened. Don't see why anyone needs to verify anything. I've done nothing wrong, Sheriff. If you're looking for someone to blame for that boy's troubles, you'd best look elsewhere. The defensive tone raised Hartwell's suspicions, but suspicion wasn't evidence. Muller's story was plausible. His papers appeared to be in order, and several townspeople confirmed seeing him around the store area that day, though none could pinpoint exact times. The investigation continued through the autumn, but leads were scarce and evidence non-existent. Sheriff Hartwell interviewed every resident of Cedar Creek and the surrounding farms, compiled detailed timelines, mapped every possible route Samuel might have taken. Nothing emerged to explain how a 12-year-old boy could disappear without a trace in broad daylight. Meanwhile, Jonas Muller's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He'd always been a private man, but by October he'd become nearly reclusive, emerging from his quarters only for essential supplies. When spoken to, he was nervous, agitated, quick to take offense at innocent comments. On October 30th, Muller abruptly announced his departure from Cedar Creek. He claimed his business affairs required him to travel to New Mexico, said he'd found a wagon train willing to take him on. The timing struck many as suspicious, leaving just as winter approached, when sensible travelers settled in to wait for spring. Thomas Bradshaw later remembered Muller's final payment for his lodging. Instead of the usual coins or small bills, the merchant had paid with a $20 gold piece, far more valuable than anything he'd previously shown. When Bradshaw commented on it, Muller had grown agitated, claimed it was payment from a distant business associate for goods delivered months earlier. Struck me as odd, Bradshaw would later say. Man had been paying in small change for weeks, then suddenly produces gold coin worth more than most folks here see in a year. Muller left Cedar Creek on November the 2nd, 1876, his wagon loaded with goods and supplies. Several residents watched his departure from their doorways, and many felt a sense of relief at seeing the last of him. If he was involved in Samuel Porter's disappearance, at least his presence would no longer remind them daily of their failure to protect one of their own. But Samuel remained missing, and Muller's departure brought no answers, only the frustration of a potential suspect beyond reach. The investigation officially ended in early 1877, when Sheriff Hartwell was transferred to another county, and his replacement declined to pursue what appeared to be a hopeless case. Ezra and Margaret Porter continued their private search for years, placing advertisements in newspapers across Texas and the neighboring territories, offering a substantial reward for information about their son. The reward notices described Samuel in painful detail. Fair-haired boy, blue eyes, small scar on left hand from farm accident, last seen wearing white cotton shirt and dark suspenders, carries pocket knife with bone handle, answers to Samuel or Sam. The notices appeared in papers from Houston to El Paso, from New Orleans to Denver, generating occasional responses, but no credible sightings. Cedar Creek moved forward because it had no choice, but the community was changed by Samuel's disappearance. Parents watched their children more closely, insisted on accompaniment for errands that had previously been routine. The easy trust that had characterized frontier neighborliness was replaced by wariness, by awareness that danger could hide behind familiar faces. Margaret Porter never recovered from her son's loss. She died in 1884, 8 years after Samuel's disappearance, her constitution weakened by years of grief and hope deferred. Neighbors said she'd never stopped watching the road, never stopped expecting to see a fair-haired boy walking home for supper. Ezra lived longer, but not happier, becoming increasingly isolated as the years passed. He kept Samuel's room exactly as the boy had left it, maintained a vigil at the front window each evening as if his son might still return from some overlong errand. When he died in 1923, the last photograph of Samuel still sat on the mantelpiece, surrounded by 47 years of accumulated dust and sorrow. The Porter farm was sold to a family from back east, people with no knowledge of its tragic history. Samuel's room was cleaned out, his few possessions distributed among neighbors or buried in the backyard. The new owners painted over the pencil marks on the doorframe where Ezra had measured his son's growth, erasing the physical evidence of a life that had never reached its full stature. But stories have a way of persisting even when evidence disappears. Cedar Creek remembered Samuel Porter passed down the tale of his disappearance through generations of families. Children grew up hearing about the boy who'd vanished, learning from his example to stay close to home, to be wary of strangers, to understand that safety was never guaranteed, even in familiar places. By 1920, Cedar Creek had grown into a proper town of several thousand residents, connected to Dallas by railroad and automobile roads. The frontier era seemed as distant as ancient history to the new generation, a time of hardship and danger that modern civilization had left behind, which made the arrest of Jonas Mueller in 1923 all the more shocking to the community that remembered his name. Detective Ray Morrison of the Dallas Police Department had been investigating a series of unsolved murders dating back to the 1870s, cases that shared certain disturbing similarities. Young victims, isolated crime scenes, perpetrators who moved frequently and left few traces. The work was painstaking, involving examination of old records from across Texas and the surrounding states. Mueller's name had surfaced in connection with several of these investigations, not as a suspect initially, but as someone who'd been present in various communities around the time suspicious disappearances occurred. A traveling merchant who'd been in Waco when a teenage girl vanished in 1878. A horse trader who'd passed through Austin shortly before a young boy disappeared in 1881. A gun dealer who'd been questioned about missing children in El Paso in 1885. The pattern might have been coincidental, if not for one crucial piece of evidence discovered in a storage room at the Tarrant County Sheriff's Office. Among boxes of old case files, Detective Morrison found a collection of personal items that had been confiscated from various suspects over the decades, but never connected to specific crimes. One item in particular caught his attention: a bone-handled pocket knife, well made but worn with use. Attached to it was a faded evidence tag dated 1895, indicating it had been taken from a man arrested for public drunkenness in Fort Worth. The man's name was listed as Jonas Mitchell, but the physical description matched records Morrison had compiled for Jonas Muller. More importantly, the knife matched perfectly the description in the old reward notices that Ezra Porter had placed in newspapers for decades after Samuel's disappearance. "Carries pocket knife with bone handle," the notices had read, offering $25 for information about a fair-haired boy who'd vanished from Cedar Creek in 1876. Detective Morrison began a systematic search for Jonas Muller, using every name the man might have adopted, every community where he might have settled. The search took months, following a trail that led through New Mexico, Colorado, and eventually back to Texas, where Muller had apparently spent his later years moving between small towns, always staying just long enough to avoid drawing attention. In September 1923, 47 years after Samuel Porter's disappearance, Morrison finally located his quarry. Jonas Muller, now 73 years old and calling himself Jonas Mitchell, was living in a boarding house in Beaumont, Texas, surviving on a small pension he claimed was payment for military service in the Indian Wars. The man Morrison found bore little resemblance to the robust merchant who'd left Cedar Creek in 1876. Age and hard living had reduced him to a stooped, gray-haired figure who seemed to blend into the shadows of the boarding house where he'd taken a back room. But his eyes, when Morrison showed his badge and explained his purpose, revealed the same evasiveness that Sheriff Hartwell had noted decades earlier. The arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic. Muller offered no resistance when Morrison placed him in handcuffs, seemed almost relieved that the long game of hiding and running had finally ended. During the ride back to Dallas, he spoke little, staring out the window at the Texas landscape, as if seeing it for the first time. The news of Muller's arrest sent shockwaves through the communities he'd touched over the decades. Cedar Creek, now a thriving town with electric lights and paved streets, suddenly found itself confronting a ghost from its frontier past. Residents who remembered Samuel Porter's disappearance gathered at Bradshaw's store, now run by Thomas Bradshaw's son, to share memories and speculate about what Muller might finally confess. The interrogation began on October 1st, 1923, in a small room at Dallas Police Headquarters. Detective Morrison faced the man who'd evaded justice for nearly half a century, armed with evidence both physical and circumstantial, determined to extract the truth about crimes that had haunted multiple communities. Muller initially maintained his innocence regarding all accusations. He admitted to being a traveling merchant in the 1870s, acknowledged staying in Cedar Creek during the summer of 1876, but denied any involvement in Samuel Porter's disappearance or any other crimes. "I was just a man trying to make a living," he said, his voice weak but defiant, "moving from place to place, selling what goods I could find. If children went missing in towns where I happened to be, that's coincidence, nothing more." Morrison presented the pocket knife, explained its significance. Muller examined it with trembling hands, his expression unreadable. "Could be anyone's knife," he said finally. "Plenty of men carry such things." But, as Morrison continued questioning, presenting evidence from multiple jurisdictions, timelines that placed Mueller in various towns at the exact times children had disappeared, the old man's composure began to crack. The breakthrough came when Morrison mentioned the $20 gold piece that Mueller had used to pay his final bill in Cedar Creek. Record-keeping in frontier towns had been sporadic, but Thomas Bradshaw's son had preserved his father's ledgers, including the note about Mueller's unusual payment. "Where does a traveling merchant get gold coin worth more than most folks' annual wages?" Morrison asked, especially a merchant who'd been paying in small change for months. Mueller was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands folded on the interrogation table. "You know where it came from," Morrison continued. "Same place the knife came from. Same place as all the other items you took from children who trusted you, who followed you because you seemed safe, familiar." "I never meant," Mueller began, then stopped. "Never meant what?" Morrison pressed. The confession came slowly, in fragments, over 3 days of questioning. Mueller admitted to killing Samuel Porter, but claimed it had been accidental, the result of the boy fighting when Mueller tried to take him from the road. According to Mueller's account, he'd been watching Samuel for weeks, noting the boy's routine trips to town, his habit of walking alone. On September 14th, he'd followed Samuel from Bradshaw's store, waited until the boy reached the isolated stretch of road near the oak grove. "I told him I had something to show him," Mueller said, his voice barely audible. "Something valuable I thought his father might want to buy. He was curious, followed me into the trees. But when I tried to, when he realized what I intended, he fought, screamed. I had to stop the screaming." Mueller claimed to have strangled Samuel to keep him quiet, then panicked when he realized the boy was dead. He'd hidden the body in a sinkhole deep in the woods, weighted down with rocks, then returned to town to maintain his normal routine. The gold coin, he admitted, had been payment for Samuel's life from someone else, another predator who collected children for purposes Mueller refused to discuss. The confession revealed not just a single murder, but participation in a network of crimes spanning decades and multiple states. Detective Morrison felt sick as the scope of Mueller's activities became clear. Samuel Porter hadn't been an isolated victim, but part of a systematic pattern of predation that had destroyed families across the Southwest. The trial of Jonas Mueller began in November 1923, generating newspaper coverage across Texas. Families from multiple communities traveled to Dallas, hoping to learn the fate of their own missing children, seeking closure that had been delayed for decades. Mueller pled guilty to the murder of Samuel Porter and to federal charges related to the interstate trafficking of children. His confession implicated several other men, leading to additional arrests and investigations, but many questions remained unanswered. How many children had been taken? How extensive was the network? What had happened to the ones who weren't killed immediately? On December 15, 1923, Jonas Mueller was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out 3 months later in the yard of the Dallas County Courthouse, witnessed by a small crowd that included Detective Morrison and several family members of Mueller's victims. Mueller's final statement was brief and unrepentant. "I done what I done," he said. "Ain't no point in sorry now." The recovery of Samuel Porter's remains proved impossible. The sinkhole Mueller described had been filled in years earlier during land development, its location lost to time and progress. But his confession provided the closure that Ezra and Margaret Porter had died without receiving, the knowledge that their son's disappearance had finally been explained and his killer punished. A memorial service was held in Cedar Creek on the 47th anniversary of Samuel's disappearance, September 14, 1923. The entire community attended, gathering in the same Methodist church where Samuel had once sung in the choir. The service honored not just Samuel, but all the children who'd been lost to predators like Muller, all the families who'd endured decades of uncertainty. The memorial plaque installed in Cedar Creek Cemetery bore a simple inscription: Samuel Porter, 1864-1876. Beloved son, his memory lives on in the hearts of those who never stopped searching for truth. Detective Morrison retired shortly after Muller's execution, his career capped by the resolution of a case that had demonstrated both the persistence of evil and the ultimate triumph of justice. In his final report, he wrote, "Some crimes echo across decades, their impact rippling through generations." The murder of Samuel Porter reminds us that no case is ever truly closed until truth is revealed and justice served. The boarding house where Muller had spent his final years was torn down in 1925, replaced by a small park dedicated to the memory of missing children. A fountain in the center bore the inscription, "In memory of the lost, in hope for the found, in determination that such tragedies shall not be forgotten." Cedar Creek continued to grow and prosper, eventually becoming a suburb of Dallas, its frontier origins preserved mainly in the Historical Society's museum. But Samuel Porter's story remained part of the community's DNA, a reminder that progress and civilization could never completely eliminate the darkness that sometimes hides in human hearts. Today, visitors to the Cedar Creek Historical Museum can view artifacts from the Samuel Porter case. Copies of the original reward notices, photographs of the 1923 investigation, testimonies from residents who remembered the boy's disappearance. The exhibit serves as both historical record and warning, a reminder that vigilance and community care are eternal necessities. The most powerful artifact is a reproduction of the daguerreotype that sat on Ezra Porter's mantelpiece for 47 years. Samuel's young face looks out from the sepia tones, serious but hopeful, unaware of the fate that awaited him just 2 months after the photograph was taken. Beneath the image, a placard tells his story in simple terms. Samuel Porter disappeared while walking home from town on September 14, 1876. His killer was finally brought to justice in 1923, 47 years later. Samuel's memory reminds us that every missing child matters, every family deserves answers, and justice delayed is not always justice denied. On September 14th each year, someone places fresh flowers beneath Samuel's memorial plaque. Sometimes it's descendants of the families who knew him. Sometimes it's visitors moved by his story. The flowers are different each year. Wildflowers from the Texas prairie, roses from careful gardens, simple daisies, picked by children who understand that Samuel was once young like them. The tradition began the year after Muller's execution and has continued for a century since, a testament to the enduring power of memory and the human need to honor those whose lives were cut short by violence. In the end, Samuel Porter's legacy is not just the tragedy of his death, but the persistence of love and remembrance that kept his story alive until truth could finally emerge from darkness. His killer was caught, tried, and executed. His case was solved and justice served. But perhaps most importantly, Samuel was remembered. Not as a statistic or a cold case, but as a beloved son whose loss touched an entire community, and whose memory continues to inspire vigilance, compassion, and hope for all the children who come after.